introduction. So today I'm looking at the book of Revelation. So if we go to the book of Revelation, chapter 1 as an introduction, and then choose, say, New International Version. I like the interlinear as a great way to start. We see that it begins the revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave to show his servants what must soon come to place. He made it known by sending his angel to the servant John, who testified to everything that he saw. That is the word of God, the testimony of Jesus Christ. And interesting, it says he saw rather than just heard. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. Blessed are those who hear it and take it to heart, what is written in it, because the time is near. And then John to the 7 churches, grace and peace from him who is, who was, who is to come, and from the 7 spirits from his throne, and from Jesus, who is the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. So I think one of the great themes is rulership and kings. To him who loves us, who's freed us from our sins by his blood, so there's a redemption theme, who has made us to be a kingdom and priests to serve with his God and Father. To him be glory and power forever and ever. Amen. Look, he's coming in the clouds. So beginning with Matthew first. Matthew, what are your thoughts on the book of Revelation? What's this book about?
Well, I've had a few different views of it. I guess the tradition that I was brought up in, coming from a Pentecostal Christian outreach centre, 25 years history. Barry Smith used to come through, and he had, which I now understand to be a futuristic view of Revelation. So yeah, Revelation maps onto current events. Christ's return is imminent. Lots of talk of mark of the beast and technology, new world orders, the whole gamut, which was, very, very interesting.
Very good. Before we go further, let's ask Samuel, what's your background and how has Book of Revelation been read from your background and experience?
Maybe probably more probably something happening in the future. But then over time, something as a definite full kind of aspect of time and future, but also you see kind of a lot of happening even now and throughout history. The fullness of it happens at the end times, but there are miniature versions that happen throughout.
Yeah, now part of that, of course, may have come from your study of history, etc. So has that expanded your idea that these events of the Book of Revelation could be happening throughout history and that you've done some study of history?
I think in things like history and just theology of history more, learning more, and go and actually the idea of just some kind of future time will happen, but actually more than that, it actually
And I like that it's showing how things happen. One of the concerns I have with the first view, what's going to happen in the future, is that it can be too simplistic. It can be too simple. That is, it just says, trust in God, there's going to be horrendous things, but you're one of the lucky few, you'll make it. And so while this is a message of comfort, too simple a message of comfort may not fully engage with the issues. And that's what I think I really like by what you're saying. Matthew, how have your views changed then from the Barry Smith follower of seeing that the world is on the edge of ending. How have your
Yeah.
views changed?
Doing some theology. I had to, one of my jobs was teaching scripture in a high school, which sort of got me into teaching. And part of my role was I had to do some theology. So I enrolled myself in a diploma of theology, which was enough for me to be able to continue on with the job. But of course, in doing that, I learned that there's four major views of Revelation. Another one of those being the preterist view, that this has all occurred within Israel's history. Very strong arguments in there. So that's, just another view that I looked into and made a lot of sense, which, was the polar opposite to looking at something that is about to happen to something that has happened.
And I really like that, in that you've shown two different ways of starting with today's event, or starting with the original setting. And I think the trouble with starting with today's events like technology and the New World Order is that that's quite foreign and distant to the original author. And I think you're always going to end up with difficulties if you or I write a book and then someone decides to move hundreds of years through time and then interpret our book in the context of hundreds of years distance. There's always going to be a problem there. And I think the meaning of words, the meaning of symbols, all of those things have changed a lot. And so I think while we do need to be relevant to today, this is not a good starting point. It's a point that you can come to later. And I like what you say about the preterist view. That is, if you start with the original setting and with the original history and with the original literary setting, then I think you're going to have a bit more success. Your thoughts on the preterist view, Samuel, in starting with the original setting? That is, what's happening in Daniel with the Babylonian captivity, what's happening in Revelation with Rome and Nero and Domitian. How do you see this as changing our views? What are your thoughts, Samuel?
I think it can be a very good start. Understand there's a lot more. Then kind of be, to make sure that we don't activities that going too much into detail and going only references this is not it's really kind of when you get to the point that only make the point back. I think really having that view or see what does it refer to better understand the story is what it can mean in a larger way by having that kind of grounded stuff.
I like what you say there. So if Daniel's only about the Babylonian captivity of 586, or if Revelation is only about Domitian or Nero in 70 AD with the fall of the temple and Jerusalem, then this only then approach is limited. Matthew, your thoughts on the preterist view and further insights on that?
Sorry. Well, it's sort of one thing. It sort of closes, the preterist view closes it to that time. That's one issue with it. So I know that there's the third view, the idealistic view, I think it is, or something, yes. Where it's kind of more of a pattern, a cyclic pattern that continues throughout world history, that we just see, you can map it on, you can map Revelation onto all of these different huge world events where these spiritual forces are playing out in different times of history, which I find very interesting. So it doesn't just lock it down to the time in which it was written, but this is a continual pattern that is playing out throughout history which will ultimately end in some kind of futuristic climax, if you like.
I like that. And so we've now introduced three of the different viewpoints, and we could also put with the first viewpoint that you mentioned, the futurist view, the historicist view,
That's
together.
the one,
Yeah, so the futurist view sees everything happening in the future. The historicist view sees everything happening throughout history. But the difficulty with the historicist view is that you've got the Apostle John seeking to describe events 50, 100 years, 500 years after it happens. And the difficulty is once you apply a portion of the book of Revelation to a time, you end up with the same problem. It then doesn't apply anywhere else, so you lock it away. And so that locks up what is said outside of your time, like the seven churches. If we're living in the last Laodicean age, then does that mean the other messages to the other six churches don't apply to us? And so the historicist view has that problem. The futurist view means that the book doesn't really apply to everyone. The preterist view would only apply historically. That's why the idealist view has quite a few followers, because it applies to everyone. So I think a good starting point is the preterist view. What did it mean historically? Then moving to the idealist view, what are the general principles? And then moving on to say, yes, there is application through history, but not only to each period in history, throughout the whole of history. And then futurist, yes, there is application at the end of time. And I think that logical order from historical preterist beginnings of study through to idealist, what are the principles, then moving on to historicist, what's it mean through history, and futurist. I think that's a good way to go, working our way through history. Let's begin now by thinking of the context of the book of Daniel. And I want to begin by looking, before we look at the book of Revelation, to look at the book of Daniel in some greater depth. And the Bible Project has a great 8-minute video that I encourage you to watch on the book of Daniel, in which the authors of the Bible Project, who do some great research, say that the narrative of Daniel is set right after the Babylonians' first attack on Jerusalem, 586 BC or thereabouts. They plunder the city and the temple, and they take a wave of Israelites into exile. I want to talk today about parallels between the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. Because when we compare this with the book of Revelation, we see that it's using similar symbols, similar concepts and ideas. And the book of Revelation is written about an attack on Israel and on Jerusalem, particularly by the Emperor Nero, and then after him by other emperors between 64 to 68 to 70 AD. And then there are pressures from Domitian around 90 AD and persecutions. So Rome was plundered as a city, and the temple in Jerusalem was plundered. Interestingly, did you know that when they plunder the city of Jerusalem and the temple, if you travel to Rome and look at the Arch of Titus in Rome, you can see there, and it still stands today, the Arch of Titus just next to the Colosseum. And on the side of the Arch of Titus, you can actually see a relief describing 2,000 years later the plundering of the temple. And they used the money from the plundering of the temple in 70 AD to build the Colosseum in Rome, which is still standing today, that was completed or built around 80 AD. So these were horrific attacks by the Romans between 64 and 70 AD that led to a huge plundering and loss of life and loss of identity and the nation, that really set the context for the book of Revelation in a similar way to which the context of the book of Daniel is set back in around 586 through to 500 AD, when the Babylonians had come through around about 586 and plundered the city. And among the captives of Daniel's time, 4 men were Belshazzar and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're carried off to Babylon. And here we have John in Apocalypse being carried off to the island of Patmos 500 or 600 years later. So the book of Daniel tells the struggles to maintain hope in the land of the conquerors, Babylon. The book of Revelation is the struggle to maintain hope when the destruction of the temple has taken place in 70 AD. So the book designs are fairly simple. You've got some history at the beginning. Book of Daniel, you've got some history. And then the book of Revelation, you've got the 7 churches in the first 2 chapters. And then you've got questions about language. Daniel's written in Hebrew and also in Aramaic, and the book of Revelation is in Greek about 600 years later. So notice in the book of Daniel, we begin with Daniel and his friends, who are wise and capable, and they serve in the royal palace. Interestingly, in the book of Revelation, we've also got royal places in Rome and Jerusalem, and also we've got heaven itself as one of the royal places. You've got temples in Jerusalem about to be threatened, and you've got other temples in heaven and temples in Rome, although we find at the end of the book of Revelation there's no temple, in that God's presence comes down from heaven and dwells amongst us, rather than limited to a temple. So when we look at some of the background to the book of Revelation, if you go to the ancient ruins, you can see Roman temples, just like back in earlier times. You could see Roman temples. Now, if you go to the centre of Rome today, you can see the remains of the temples and the buildings in the centre of Rome, and you can explore those. And other cities around the world are interesting to explore. In the centre of Rome, there's the Pantheon, meaning many gods. And so here is the temple to the many gods. 2,000 years ago, the temple in many ways survives, the Parthenon temple. And so you've got this wonderful building that you can go to. I went to the Parthenon once a few years back, and they had British orchestra came over and they sang in the centre of this Roman Parthenon. And then at the end of their music playing, they got up and shook hands with an instrument in one hand, violin and cello, shaking hands with you, thank you for listening. But it seemed amazing that here they were in a 2,000-year-old building where gods had been worshipped 2,000 years ago, and now had been a church for many years, and there'd been Christian worship in this place many years later. So the Parthenon in Rome, which means Temple of the Gods, has been a church for many, many years, and you can visit that today. And so there's lots of other temples as well that you can go to, and some of these other temples are found in the Temple of Saturn, is there in the centre of Rome today, where they would go to worship. So it was a battle for temples, and it was a battle between gods and also between political powers that we see that led to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So in Daniel's book, there was the destruction of the temple 600 years prior to the destruction of the temple described in the book of Revelation as a background setting. In Daniel, they're pressurizing the Jews to give up living and eating. And in the book of Revelation, we have this pressure on the followers of God and Jesus. And so the book of Daniel also has the king of Babylon has a dream. And here we have a vision and dream in the book of Revelation. In the king of Babylon's first dream, there's a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, representing 4 kingdoms: the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and then the Greeks. And then a rock comes through and hits the statue, and it falls down. And the rock is the presence of God and a kingdom that God will establish for all time, which we Christians understand as the presence of Jesus. And it's interesting, in the book, they talk about Rome and Babylon, and there could be destruction coming from it. Roman Empire has come to an end, but there is a place in Rome when there are many people who still worship a God that's situated in the center of Rome, and that's Vatican City. And there are more people following Jesus and religion in many ways, with 2 billion people in Rome now. So in some ways, Rome has been overtaken by Christians, as predicted in some ways in the books of Daniel and the book of Revelation. So there's intriguing twists and turns in the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation when you read it from a historical perspective. In chapter 3, we have the story of Daniel's 3 friends. In the book of Daniel, they refuse to bow down and they're persecuted. And in the same way, in the book of Revelation, there is questions about those who are refusing to bow down and are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace. In some ways, the book of Revelation describes a fiery furnace of persecution. God delivers the friends from the fiery furnace, and then they're exalted by the king. And then we have the Babylonian kings, the father Nebuchadnezzar and his son Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar repents and is changed. And then God warns them both in dreams and visions. And the king Nebuchadnezzar becomes like a beast in the field. We'll see that there's lots of images of beasts. And this leads to a psychological thought that I thought Matthew might be interested in, is that are there beasts within every person? And is there a difference between beasts that are a bit wild and uncontrolled, like lions and bulls, and then can we tame the beasts? And then in every ruler and king and political ruler, do people behave a bit beastly, or do they need to really be in the image of God, being kind and loving and thoughtful and being transformed and changed? And I wonder whether the book of Revelation is about this tension between beastliness and between being created truly in the image of God, where we're transformed and changed. So the images in Daniel and Revelation also go back to the beginning of our study in the book of Genesis, where in chapters 1 and 2, there's the creation of all things, and God moves amongst us and he creates humankind. And in Psalm 2 and Psalm 8, humans are depicted as being in the image of God. And the question is, do we sometimes become like beasts, or are we truly in the image of God? So God has given humankind authority to rule over the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, on behalf of God, who is the true king over creation. Do we do that? Do kings do that for the good of all people? Or do we sometimes revert to a beastliness within, and do kingdoms become rather beastly because the kings become rather beastly? So we see a tension here in human affairs. We are to rule over the beasts of the world, the whales, the lions, the tigers, elephants, bulls, serpents, crocodiles, eagles. But can we ever truly rule over beasts of the earth? I mean, can anyone ever rule over a cat? I mean, that would be very difficult. They know who's in control, and they rule over us in some ways. Matthew, what are your thoughts about this idea of the books of Daniel and Revelation being about beastliness and about creation there? And then I'll ask Samuel as well. But Matthew, your thoughts. Do you have any thoughts on beastliness in the book of Revelation?
It's the first time I've heard about that kind of reading, and I do like it because it kind of it's a bit more of an inward turn to more of an anthropology view of it. And I think, I mean, that's the that's a really good way of being able to apply it to who we are and make a sense of it, because it can be so, when we start to try to attribute a lot of these different ideas into large global scales, perhaps this is a good way of being able to make it more personal. And I think very much so. I think there is, as we follow our own will, we become more beast-like. The more we submit ourselves to God's will, we live out the image of God on earth. So it's a great way of looking at it, I think.
I like this idea of making it personal, where we do have responsibility, where we have tasks and responsibilities that we have to look to, and not just looking at a distance at powerful politics. We are involved, and we have to take responsibility for our involvement in this book, rather than seeing the events of the book at a distance. Samuel, what are your thoughts about this idea of beastliness and the books of Daniel and Revelation, and particularly Revelation in particular, being about beastliness?
I think, like what I said, where it's kind of been following your desires such that how basically they will beastly nature is in there. Exploring the idea of weird mixed hybrid things that aren't normally they monsters, dragons, which is a mixture of animals, snake like chaotic way. Then there's like the idea of authority. That's almost living by expecting those who are authority and power to use for good, and not just their own rules and ideas. And so I can see improper authority just doing a which is not what's on.
And we've looked at the discussion of monsters in literature. That's very good, Samuel. So this raises issues relating to evil and what's the nature of evil. And we looked before about labelling others as monsters often reveals monsters within us. And so if we read the book of Revelation in a simple way of simply labelling, so the book of Revelation as an act of labelling has a certain danger to it. You know, we are the saved people, we're the happy people, we're on the side of the lion, everyone else is going to be smashed up by meteorites and things. Then that sort of labelling can be dangerous. And this raises the question whether Tim LaHaye or Barry Smith are following this simple act of labelling. Whereas if, as we said before, we see ourselves on the side of the crushed and the hurt, like the lamb rather than the lion, then on the side of the lambs, we see ourselves with the suffering. Then we may take a different view. So instead of labelling people as monsters, yes, there are monstrous people out there, but there are also monsters within us, and we need to turn it around and see hope. Matthew, do you have thoughts on monsters here and the labelling of others in this act of seeking to define evil as out there rather than evil within?
It's interesting in literature how monsters are always on the edge of society. They are on the very outskirts of what is of the norm.
Mm.
That's where you encounter them, where you find them. And I've heard it, again, this is coming back to this guy I listened to, what's his name? It's avoided me at the moment. But the idea of the monster is like a gatekeeper to the unknown. They also, they kind of, they're the bridge between what is knowable and what we do know. And they're like these guardians. They're both good. They play a good role and a bad role. Yeah, it's just an observation. I haven't got much more than that, but I think, yeah, again, I like some of the stuff Jordan Peterson talks about, how if we were, if we were to be a German citizen during the Second World War, how we potentially could become part of that monstrous ideology.
Yes, yes, I think that's right. And so I think this raises issues of violence as well that we could explore more fully. In Daniel chapter 6, which is a pair to Daniel chapter 3, the hero Daniel faces the challenge of ruling over the beast and the lion. And in some ways, the theme of a lion is picked up in the book of Revelation. But again, the image is replaced by a lamb in Revelation. So there is the thought here that we have to be careful. If we see ourselves on the side of a lion, we may in fact be stepping on the side of the powerful and the Romans, rather than recognizing that we've been called to stand with Jesus and the suffering rather than the triumphal. That is, we can fall into the same trap that the Romans have fallen into. That is, we can see ourselves as all powerful again. And you raise, both Samuel and Daniel, the idea of the marginalised. I think this book of Revelation, in some ways, marginalised people often like to take the book and say, hey, we're going to triumph. But there's a real danger in that the marginalised people often twist the book to suit their own ends. And one of the ways they twist it, we've already mentioned, is hermeneutically, in terms of interpretation. That is, they only look at their own world today. That is, it's the Russians, it's the Chinese, and etc. They don't go back to deeper questions and issues of the original context and deeper questions of meaning. And I think they do the same with violence. That is, they almost take up pride as a characteristic of themselves today. So this then brings us to chapter 7. At the middle of the book, center of the book of Daniel, we have another dream this time, and this time there are 4 beasts, and they are the lion, the bear, and the winged leopard. And so here we see that this could be kingdoms like we've had kingdoms in the time of Daniel were Assyria and Babylon and Persia, and then comes Greece and Rome. And throughout all history, we had kingdoms that rule. And Matthew, you mentioned the in our own last 100 years, we've had World War II has been fought with many kingdom powers battling. So each of the beasts in the book, from an idealized point of view, symbolize arrogant kingdoms, and the last super beast is identified as really evil, has lots of horns, which are a symbol of kings in the Old Testament. So notice that when animals go to battle with horns, they often use their horns. Bulls fight each other, creatures fight each other. Even humans in Spain fight against bulls, don't they? They run through the streets with bulls chasing them. And so there's a sense of power for an animal that comes through its horns. But with the book of Revelation, Jesus is speaking, and his power is the sword out of his mouth. It's the words. And so the book here is pointing to a different sort of power, the power of words. We come in the center of the book of Daniel to the central crisis point or plot or issue. How do people face the crisis of the abuse of power and authority? And we find the same in the book of Revelation around about chapter 12. the central chapters have to do with the central question: how do people face the crisis of abuse of power and authority? And in Revelation chapter 12, we have the woman who has the child who's pursued by the dragon. And in some ways, it's the abuse of power that takes the child of the mother and takes Jesus and puts him on the cross. Rome does bring a lot of good to the world. Perhaps it brings great roads. I mean, no one could build roads like the Romans, and brings some good justice. We still use Latin in courts of law many centuries later. So Rome does some good, but power can be corrupted. And they say in the crucifixion of Jesus, power could have been corrupted. The woman is chased, that is, the Jewish people are chased by the Romans, and we have huge amounts of destruction take place around about 62 to 68 AD. Interestingly, Daniel 7:4, the beast is given the heart of a man. Interestingly, the beast has the teeth of iron, and I immediately think of the Roman short sword, which they used to such effect. And then in Romans 7:9, in the center of the book, we have the Ancient of Days, like the book of Ezekiel. And then we have the central verse is that the figure called the Son of Man, one like the Son of Man, comes out of heaven, brings hope to the world. And it strikes me that the man here represents someone who is truly in God's image, a son of man, truly has the heart and conscience and responsibility that God has made man to have. And so this has the true characteristics of a person, like we read about in Genesis chapter 1 to 3, that is really made in God's image in Genesis 1 to 3, in God's image. We should truly resemble and represent and have that image of God, in that we should truly be godly rather than beastly, I think, is the thought here, in the thought, the Son of Man. And Jesus uses this word, Son of Man, which comes partly from Daniel chapter 7, to describe what he's doing. And I think the impact that Jesus has had on the world comes from Jesus being a truly man who's willing to show love, speak of the love of God, who's willing to go to the cross, willing to suffer for all mankind, who demonstrates what being a man can be all about. And so I think that image of the Son of Man comes through very strongly there. So just a couple of thoughts in the middle of this book, chapter 7, from Matthew and then Samuel. Matthew, what are your thoughts about this central theme of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, and Jesus being truly like people should be here? What are your thoughts, Matthew, on this?
Well, it just reminded me of another reading of Revelation, which is like it's another gospel.
I like that.
Written with
So Jesus is bringing the good news, isn't he? Hope to the world. Samuel, what are your thoughts on the Son of Man as a central theme, with the Ancient of Days in the center of this book?
Kind of gospel get very merciful Christ, and the Son of Man is very judging Christ coming back, so kind of there's also judgment in there. And it's also it's the emphasis on the Son of Man, the emphasis on the incarnation as a full aspect of what the name.
And often when you stand before a king or someone important, you can feel judged. And to stand here at the center of the book of Daniel, before the Ancient of Days and before the Son of Man, who's the perfect man, then you do feel a bit of judgment come against you. And so I think the book does bring this sense of judgment. which should lead kings and people, nations and everyday people to be less beastly and to be more really human and more like the people that we have been called to be. Some people look to covenant as the covenant that's made through the line of David. Others look to God and Jesus sitting on the throne, and the destruction of these other beasts by Christ there. So the visions encourage patience, that God's in control, that he's going to work all things out. And then in chapter 8 of Daniel, we then have another vision of a ram who's like the Medes and the Persians with the two horns. And then we have a vision of the goat, who is like the ancient Greeks and Alexander the Great and the Greek armies. And I'm reminded that the Greeks give us great language and literature and politics, and many look back to the politics of the Greeks as an idea of what democracy could be about. Any powerful group like Alexander the Great and the Greeks could also be quite destructive with their power as well. So there is this issue of power that's raised in the books of Daniel and the book of Revelation, which speaks to the big questions of power in nations, but also to the questions of power in every human and in every human relationship. And then in chapter 9, Daniel is puzzled by all the things that are going to take place. He consults the scroll of the prophet of Jeremiah, and this idea of a scroll is then taken up in the book of Revelation. God and Israel's exile, instead of 70 years, they're now told that there's going to be a much longer period of suffering because of their sin. And then we have the sequence of kings that follow. And then some see the great cataclysm that follows could be the Syrian king Antiochus, but others point to the Roman Empire's role in the destruction of Jerusalem that occurs there in 70 AD. So we see in the book of Daniel many parallels as one of the final books of the Old Testament, what's going to happen. Some see this as predictions of just the future, futurism. Some see this as how things will unfold in particular parts of history. But many scholars say, read it in the historical context first. Think about what it meant to the writers, and then read it in terms of the ideals. And we see the book of Daniel and Revelation says that there are problems and challenges with power in every person's life. There are problems and challenges of power in every communal group, be it a church or an organisation. There are problems of power in every nation with every king and every political ruler. So all these problems and issues of power are raised there. Your thoughts, Samuel, on this question of reading Daniel and Revelation in terms of power and issues of questions of power?
I don't think we mainly the idea of government power must submit themselves and do God instead of if they try and take it themselves to do what they want, then you have the problems of misuse power. So it's the idea of those who are using the power, not using it to serve God. Their time is limited.
Yes. Yes.
So the proper rule of God will be completely manifest. Will take over all at the end. There will be those who hold it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And Matthew, your thought on this book being about issues of power and issues within, rather than just watching events from a distance.
Yeah, when you said before about chapter 7, you know, the fact that it is looking at the nature of Jesus, you know.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. So if we see that we have here, the book of
then
Daniel.
moving from a beast nature to
Mm.
the nature of God, I think is a really interesting way of looking at it. And perhaps there's that's a key thing there, when right at the center of the book, we've got the vision of the Son of Man.
I really like that thought, moving from the beast nature and the image of the beast to the nature of God and the image of God. I think that's terrific. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, yeah, the things that are in our control then too, you know, all these other readings are so out of our control, like, you know, putting it on a world scale. You know, we're kind of just recipients of what's happening to us. But, you know, if we can just think about how we can be more like God, we have that responsibility and we can do something about it.
They're putting it on a human scale.
Yeah, it's a really powerful way of looking at Revelation.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, powerful way to look at Revelation, to look at this book. So it's been said by the Bible Project in their book on Daniel that the book of Daniel is that making a point that all generations of readers can find a pattern and a promise. And the pattern is that people and rulers will act in beastly ways at times with uncontrolled subconscious passions, making war and violence, manipulating economies, relationships and laws, but they can't rule and manipulate forever. And so in the end, the eternal one, God and Jesus, they are going to rule. And God will often act through suffering servants, like in Isaiah 53, through the true man of God, who's willing to suffer as part of God's plan, whom God raises up to bring about his purpose. What is the promise? The promise is that God will send his representative or representatives, the people of God, godly people, and that God will work in the heart of each person, community and nation to establish his purposes. And we see this in the life of Paul. And Paul was beastly, but then he was converted. And then rather than being part of the religious, he then goes out and steps out with faith in God. And so now he's part of the Christ-like image that's changing the world. So pattern, the human beings and kingdoms often can become like violent beasts. They can glorify and be led by their own power, but they can redefine right as wrong and redefine wrong as right, not acknowledge or respect God as their true king, and not follow God's call for humility, love and care like true shepherds. And I like what you said, Matthew, is that the call of this book is to be transformed and changed so that we can be part of the better world that the book looks forward to. We can be part of that which is changing the beast. And it's so tempting to become beastly, to face the beastly. What we need to do is to become lambs like Jesus and acknowledge that we have to become willing to suffer. At times, like Hannah Arendt has said, we've got to stand up with truth to power and suffer. And in many ways, Jesus does stand up with truth to power and he suffers. And at times we've got to suffer in order to bring the change and transformation to pass that we've been called to speak to. So the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation are about this challenging message of truth speaking to power, and that there are beastly natures that can be defeated by that. So let's take our break there, and we'll come back after the break and look further into the book of Revelation and the insights that we can get from this book.